All right, guys, we are back for a little more reading of Leave No Trace. So we're picking up on chapter 8. Now, that was a half hour well spent. As Officer Keisha Miller and I badged out, most of the eyes on the board, too, followed our every move. The normal fights over the TV had stopped. Hands twitched, and several heads had sunk behind the protective barrier of the couches. It wasn't my idea, I'd advised Dr. Mita, that Lucas wouldn't talk to the police, but pressure from the Duluth PD and the U.S. Forest Service had become intense, so we agreed to facilitate an interview with Lucas. Officer Miller, our liaison police officer, had asked question after question, while Lucas clenched his fist and stared out the window. He's not ready to talk to the authorities. I inched her toward the stairs as she methodically folded up the Boundary Waters maps and shook her head. Got a giant "F U" plastered to his forehead, if you ask me. He's a forensic mental health patient. Three more of them were peering through the door of the ward, tracking the receding flash of the officer's tie clip and badge. I just recorded 30 minutes of me talking to a wall. The chief said they're desperate for leads, and what am I going to give him? The most I've done today is chase two groupies off the property. They got inside the gate. Don't ask me how. Both of them were carrying "Free Lucas Blackthorne" signs, which is the first time I've seen that. We've gone from interest to protest, and now I'm clocking more time cruising the perimeter of this place than actually inside it. Officer Miller's shoes echoed in the stairwell as we descended to the first floor. Next to her, my tread was almost silent. We badged into the main hall and toward the front entrance, where shards of sunlight sliced the walls. "I need a favor. There were more of them this morning." She nodded past the doors into the parking lot and beyond. "He wants out and they want in. I'm trying to piece together the Blackthorns' last days before they disappeared, and I need to find a copy of a police report. Josiah Blackthorne was arrested, no charges filed, in northern Minnesota." She paused near the security desk, putting her hat on. "That'd be public record. You know how to fill out forms, right?" "It's urgent, and there might be a related case, but I don't know the details. I wouldn't know what to request." The men in Ward 2 had exhibited acute stress response symptoms at the sight of Officer Miller's uniform: paleness, dilated pupils, shaking. I kept my hand still and waited while she looked me up and down. "You're his speech therapist. Your job is just to help him talk, right? Maybe it'll give us something to talk about." After a beat, she nodded, slipped her sunglasses on, and told me to email her the details of the arrest. Officer Miller and I had gone through the Congdon orientation together, along with a roomful of other new hires and volunteers. Back when I'd first started as an orderly and she was rotating in as our liaison to the Duluth Police Force. For 2 full days we watched outdated videos and reviewed policies while she compulsively checked her phone like she was praying for a domestic disturbance to save her from the PowerPoint. I assumed she'd drawn the short straw for this gig until the end of the orientation, when Dr. Mita joined us and invited the group to share any experiences that had compelled us to work at Congdon. A moment of silence suffocated the room before, one by one, everyone started telling their stories. Someone had a bipolar friend. Another person's father was diagnosed with an antisocial personality disorder. One of the volunteers suffered from bulimia for most of her childhood until realizing she needed help. Every person in the room spoke up except the two of us. But then, after the tissues had been passed and all the bolstering smiles began to fade, Officer Miller cleared her throat. "I had a brother who was off, always low, never wanted to get help, never even wanted anyone to look at him. But I saw him. I saw him right up to the first morning of his junior year, when he split his wrist in the bathtub." Her eyes shimmered with deep pools of tears. I'd never seen an eye hold on to that much water, refusing to let it go. That was my cue. I should have reached out for Officer Miller's hand or touched her forearm and told them how every night when my mother tucked me into bed, I could see fault lines of pain cracking through her body, how the tighter I hugged her, the more she crumbled away, as if the density of my love was too much to withstand, until one night She broke completely. She left a note on my nightstand, went to the bathroom, and ate 2 bottles of aspirin. Everyone at Congdon had a story. Some of us had more than one. I used to be a patient here, I murmured, and picked at a chip spot on the table until Human Resources started handing out badges and explaining the building's layers of security. What makes someone disappear? After my mom's suicide attempt, we all tried to pretend things were fine. Mom cleaned the house and lingered in the shadows outside my school, waiting to walk me home. She showed me how to make grilled cheese and ramen noodles and how to tell the difference between gabbro and basalt. We built a rock garden in a corner of the yard, and I memorized every mineral, their Mohs scale hardness, whether they were ingenious, sedimentary, or metamorphic. Knowledge that seemed more vital than anything I was learning at school. Dad spent hours analyzing the composition of the lake bed, the shoals, all the underwater hazards that had wrecked countless ships like the Bannockburn. Maybe he thought it was something they could share, the intersection of rock and water. But we both saw how her eyes drifted off the map to places we couldn't follow. During Dad's busy season in the summer, she took me up to her family cabin near the Boundary Waters. Just her and me, and that's where she seemed the strongest. We paddled through lake after lake, silent amid the towering pines that surrounded us like a cathedral, our feet baptized on the shores of every portage. When we returned to Duluth in the fall, everything seemed dirtier, harder. She stopped waiting for me after school. Then, one day, she accepted a job conducting a copper study on the Iron Range, Minnesota's mining belt that had once turned Duluth into a boomtown, packed a bag, and left us a note saying she might not be back. 2 months later, she quit that job and began sending me rocks in the mail. A hunk of granite at the first snowfall, a nugget of amethyst for spring, carefully polished agates gleaming like birthday candles. I kept a rock and mineral field guide by my bed and studied them, trying to interpret whether a white hue meant purity or sorrow. Could I dissect her state of mind from an intricate banding pattern? There were never any return addresses on the boxes, and the postmarks came from further and further away. North Dakota, Wyoming. I tried Googling the towns, searching for her in newspaper photos and company directories, but the rocks were the only evidence she existed until one day even they stopped coming. She disappeared without a physical or digital trace. It was a gradual abandonment, like inching slowly into deeper, more frigid water until the bottom gives way. Was that better than Officer Miller's brother? 2 swift cuts and a last cascade spilling neatly into the tub's drain? They were both gone, leaving no path for anyone to follow. If Josiah had left a path, I was going to find it. While I waited for Officer Miller to find the arrest records, I began hunting, looking for other families who turned away from society. There had to be a precedent, a pattern. As the gale started battering the house, I curled up with my laptop and searched. The first and most famous case was the Lykov family of Siberia, and after I read everything I could find about them, I discovered another story, this time a different generation on a new tilt of the globe. Ho Van Thon had lived a quiet life until the Vietnam War spilled into his village and he watched his family die in an explosion. Some accounts said a mine blew up, others that the village came under siege by American bombers, and even the identity of the family members who died varied depending on who was telling the story. But they all agreed on what happened next. Thon scooped up his infant son, Lang, and fled into the jungle. Eventually, the war ended and life got back to normal. But Ho Van Thon never returned. He raised Lang in a handmade treehouse where they ate corn and fruit. They caught animals in traps, made their clothes from tree bark, and every time the nearby villages grew and expanded, Thon led his son further into the jungle, retreating almost to the top of a mountain in order to stay hidden from the world outside. 40 years passed, and Lang became the caregiver as Thon aged and sickened. They didn't know the war had ever ended until nearby villagers heard rumors of the men in the jungle and made contact with them. When Thon's condition became known, a team of people were sent to rescue him. Thon was forcibly carried off the mountain, and Lang met the world for the first time. Wide-eyed and silent, both father and son fell into a clinical depression in the months that followed, and all the viruses Lang had never encountered made him as sick as his father. It took them a year to recover, and eventually they moved to a small house near their jungle. Lang adjusted to life in the village, but Thon never did. His main ambition at 87 years old was to return to the wilderness. When a reporter asked to see the place they lived for so many decades, Lang also jumped at the opportunity to go back and set off into the jungle without a second's pause. I found other stories. Timothy, the grizzly man, Treadwell, Christopher McCandless of Alaska, and Christopher Knight, the Maine woods hermit, all loners who saw the open land as more pure and untainted by human civilization. But the Lykovs and Hovans were different. They were families, people bonded by love. The sacrifices they made were for each other. I taped up pictures of the Hovans next to the others, my refrigerator transforming into a giant milk carton of the missing, and then stood back, squinting my eyes, letting the lines between them blur. The Lykovs and the Hovans were driven into the wilderness by tragedy and murder, by the ugliness of worlds they might not have survived. Something galvanized them, something they couldn't fight or ignore. What had galvanized Josiah? He wasn't fleeing from religious persecution or escaping a war, but something made his son shake with fear 10 years later. I won't turn him over. I needed him to talk to me, to trust me, to tell me something more substantial than how disgusting the food was today. I was done being his breezy friend. Agathia, Lang, Lucas. I stared at their pictures on the fridge, the children of world-abandoning decisions. They hadn't chosen to disappear, yet they stayed. They'd remained in the wilderness for reasons beyond fear, beyond danger, because something in their environment fed them. Most children grew up hungering to see more of the world, but they had been satiated. And just like that, I knew what to do. Congdon wasn't only a building. The facility boasted sprawling grounds enclosed by a 10-foot wrought iron spiked fence. The entrance and parking lot took up the west side. The flower and vegetable therapy gardens were shriveled with their last board vines in the south, and the north and east sides boasted wooded, leaf-covered trails. Grass crunched under our feet as Bryce and I walked Lucas around the building, dressed in an oversized hooded coat. I glanced at the fence every few seconds and didn't breathe easier until we reached the evergreen cover of Congdon's own private forest. Wait here, keep an eye out, I told Bryce, who shrugged and dropped onto a bench, pulling out his phone. I led Lucas through the trees, winding our way back to a corridor of evergreens where it was darker and colder. Outside the grove, the trees looked like they grew straight into the air, but from within, they loomed toward an invisible center point, blocking out the sun and dimming even the memory of brilliance. There was no paths in here, only layers of wet needles that infused the air with pungent decay. None of the patients who had grounds privileges came here on their walks. It was too quiet, too confined. I stopped when the shadows engulfed us, when I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. The sounds of traffic and a distant airplane still intruded, but at least we were hidden from any of the protesters who might be prowling the edges of the property. It was the closest thing to boundary waters I could give him. He walked a few paces further, reaching a hand out to brush a low-hanging branch. Then he squatted down, both feet planted firmly in the needles, and closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell, and no one in yoga class had ever looked more at one with their universe. Thank you. The words were barely audible. I sat cross-legged nearby and picked up a pine cone, rolling it back and forth in my hands, waiting for him to breathe his fill. Long minutes passed, but I wasn't impatient. He wasn't the only one who found solace in the shadows. Eventually he moved, exploring the dark oasis, needles, dead branches, the hard-packed ground, and then crept over to examine me as if I was a cast-off of the trees too. He pulled out a few strands of my hair and frowned, asking what color it was supposed to be. Brown. His eyes narrowed, and then a ghost of a smile played over his face. That's 10 points. The Grinch had been teaching him Scrabble. Only if you don't land on a bonus tile. I kept my hands loose in my lap. And you should really start stacking your words. You know what oi is? He shook his head. The Scrabble dictionary calls it a westerly wind. You have no chance without oe. He grinned, but the smile died as soon as he looked at my hair again. Was it ever long? Yes. He drew back as if long brown hair frightened him. As I stared at his head, trying to figure out what was churning inside, he reached out again and picked up one of my hands. Turning it over and tracing the lines of purple veins, like a map he'd finally gotten permission to inspect. I let him, remaining silent until he began pressing on the pad of my thumb and watching the skin turn white before the blood flooded back into the tissue. We talked last week about your father. No reaction, except an increase of pressure on my thumb. You said no one could help you, and that's why you disappeared. Again, nothing. His head stayed stubbornly down. Lucas, I tugged on my trapped hand. What did you need help for? The pressure on my thumb was almost bruising now. He squeezed bone and tendon together as the red rushed in and out underneath the skin. You don't know? He asked my hand. I wrenched it out of his grip, pulling him forward so he had to catch himself before landing in my lap. His face inches from mine. His pupils were almost completely dilated, his breath unsteady. I wouldn't ask you if I did. He drew back and began inching away, but I followed, not allowing him the avoidance. As we edged over the beds of needles, his back started to tremble. I don't know what to believe. It could be a trap. Look at you. He shoved a handful of dead needles in my direction. I thought you were her, and that's why they sent you, to trick me into talking. But she's not you because you're fine. You're right here, and you're fine, and she wasn't. She wasn't fine. He backed up all the way to the base of a pine, pressing himself against the trunk and burying his head in his arms. I crept underneath the sharp branches, heart pounding. Who, Lucas? Who are you talking about? He raised his head. Santa's bag. She was draped over his shoulder, all wrapped up like a bag of toys. Who? Lucas stared into the branches with unfocused eyes, and a tremor rocked him back and forth before he swallowed and said in a plain, low voice, the body. I saw it in a flash. A woman's lifeless form thrown over a shoulder, her long brown hair swinging toward the ground. Obstruction of justice and an escape from the world to a place where justice didn't exist. Lucas, tell me about her. Did you know who she was? I grabbed his arm and the contact yanked him from his memories and sent him reeling back, hitting his head against the pine. I don't know where she is. Lucas, I made my voice as calm as possible, inching closer. Stay with me here. It's okay. I'm the last person in the world who would. Without warning, he pulled my feet out from underneath me. My spine hit the ground and a rock grazed my head. The white noise of crunching needles made me roll over to see Lucas sprinting out of the trees. Shouting for Bryce, I scrambled through the underbrush. When I broke into the clearing near the fence, Lucas had already climbed 3/4 of the way to the top. Don't do this, Lucas. I jumped for his leg, but he kicked me off, and I stumbled back. This isn't the way, he chanted as he climbed, hoisting one foot in between the spikes, and it was only when he turned back to look at me that I caught what he was saying. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, I grunted as I hauled myself up an iron post and locked a hand over his trailing ankle. Be better. He tried to lift his body over the spikes, but I let go of the bar with my other hand and wrapped both around his foot. If he was going to escape, he'd have to haul me out with him. A bang sounded right behind my head. I couldn't look. Bryce, more scrambling, scraping, a heavy breath, and just as Lucas pulled me up another foot, hoisting his torso over the top of the spikes with a Herculean effort, an arm shoved its way over my body and connected with Lucas's shin. I don't remember the actual contact. I saw the arm, thick and blotchy, and something clutched in the hand, a round black device like a flashlight. But I knew it wasn't a flashlight. Before I could let go of Lucas's ankle, the current hit me, and an overpowering clicking noise pounded the walls of my brain. Everything seized. My body turned into one solid contraction. Muscles, tendons, and nerves all fused together. I was frozen, glued to Lucas's foot, except there was no foot. There wasn't anything except a giant master power switch that had been flipped on inside my body, and the relentless click, click, clicks that shot lightning from my head. An eternity passed before someone turned off the switch and all my muscles gave out. The dull smack of the ground was a relief. I lay on the dead leaves with my legs twisted underneath me as my senses blinked back into focus. Brain foggy but blissfully quiet. Someone ran through the leaves, crunching a frantic trail away from me, and a voice began shouting in the distance. I rolled over and forced my arms, which felt like I'd been carrying my weight in granite, to brace me up. When I looked toward the fence, I saw what the yelling was for. Lucas's body lay on the sidewalk, through the bars, and a spreading line of red snaked out from underneath his skull. Chapter 9. Lucas! I crawled to the fence and reached through the bars to shake his arm, but he was too far away. His body was crumpled toward the street, and the thick gray coat prevented me from even seeing if his chest was rising. I kept repeating his name, telling him to stay with me as I worked to pull the phone out of my jeans pocket. It seemed impossible to extract. Every muscle in my body felt weak. Just as I finally worked it free, a thundering of feet sounded from the sidewalk outside the fence, and two security guards and Bryce descended on Lucas's still-as-death form. Bryce felt his throat. "He is alive," and then started to push him to his back. "Don't move him." "I'm not." Bryce drew back and glanced at the security guard who paced the sidewalk and checked each direction of the street every 2 seconds. The other one clutched the phone to his head, muttering answers to the person on the line while he stared at the blood trailing along the sidewalk. I was on the wrong side of the fence, trapped. I wanted to run to the entrance and double back along the street, except 1, I didn't dare leave Lucas alone with these guys, and 2, I honestly didn't know if my legs would work properly yet. "What the hell were you thinking, tasing him 10 feet off the ground? You could have killed him." "What was I supposed to do?" Bryce fired back. "You nearly let him escape. Awesome plan, Maya. They teach you that in therapy school? Arguing with a moron was like kicking a boulder. Your feet would bleed before you found a fissure." But anger with Bryce was the only thing keeping the terror at bay. Bloody feet were all I had. "I had his foot. You could have called security. Or didn't they teach you how to ask for help in kindergarten?" We traded insults for another minute until one of the security guards stopped pacing and waved his arms in circles. An ambulance sped to a halt in front of us, right as Nurse Valerie jogged down the sidewalk with 2 of Lucas's fans right behind her. The medics and Valerie examined Lucas, while the security guards fought to push back the fans who were arguing about the right to peaceful assembly and holding their phones up, trying to catch as much as they could on camera. I struggled to hear the medical team's comments. Broken shoulder, laceration near the temple, multiple contusions, and then, making me release a giant breath I hadn't known I was holding, pulse stable. As they loaded Lucas into the ambulance, I stood up and immediately fell into the iron bars. The tingling ache in my body raced into my left ankle, concentrating itself into a massive throb. "Are you okay, miss?" A medic appeared on the other side of the fence. "I'm fine." I batted him off and took a lurching step sideways to prove it. "Go. She's the other Taze," Bryce said, like his only responsibility for this situation was standing off to the side, making up bullshit words. "Follow us to St. Mary's," the medic ordered before climbing in the back and shutting the doors. The ambulance took off, and lights and siren blaring. "You shouldn't walk on that, Maya," Valerie was saying, but I'd already turned and begun limp running to the building. I ducked through the pines, putting as little weight on my left side as possible, but every step felt like shoving my foot into a raging bonfire. Tears were streaming down my face by the time I retrieved my bag out of my locker, limped back to the parking lot, and got to my car. I fumbled the keys out, thanking God and Buddha and Henry Ford for designing cars with all the pedals on the right. As Nurse Valerie ran after me with an ace bandage, I waved her off and gunned the car out of the lot and into the residential streets, zigzagging my way down the hill to St. Mary's Hospital while my hands shook on the steering wheel. My only thought, as my phone buzzed incessantly from somewhere at the end of a long tunnel, was getting to Lucas. A brace, 4 hours, and five refusals of ibuprofen later, I sat in Lucas's hospital room, waiting for him to wake up. Dr. Mita didn't look much better than me when she arrived. She'd been presenting at a conference in Rochester when she got the call and drove straight to Duluth, only stopping to pick up her luggage at the hotel. As I filled her in with what I knew, the attending doctor stopped by to check on Lucas. He's incredibly lucky to be alive. The fall could have been fatal, but he's going to walk away with only minor fractures to the skull and shoulder, and likely a concussion, although we had some difficulty assessing that. Lucas stirred behind us, clanking his handcuffs against the bars of the hospital bed and groaning softly. I watched him until he quieted back down, half listening to the two of them discuss his test results, expected recovery time, and eventual transfer back to Congdon. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since I'd left Congdon, and I reluctantly checked the sites, already knowing what I would find. The video was posted to Facebook fan page, a 45-second clip of the medics hovering over Lucas, trying to zoom in on his face, and then panning over to me, lying behind the fence, and Bryce hulking in the background. 300 people had already commented, and scrolling through the noise, I caught Bryce's name being mentioned, and at least one of the guards. Swallowing, I felt a hand touch my shoulder. "You've been here the whole time?" The attending doctor had returned to his rounds, leaving the two of us alone next to Lucas's bed. "Look at this." I tilted the phone. "It'll be on the evening news." Yes, I was talking to the board on the way here, discussing the best way to handle the publicity. The sound of metal on metal came again. Even in sleep, Lucas was restless. They said he was awake for the CAT scan, but refused to answer any of their assessment questions about concussion symptoms, and the IV of pain medication had sent him back to La La Land before I gained access to see him. "I'm curious about your decision to take Lucas outside, given his case history," Dr. Mita asked. I turned to the window. Only a sliver of Superior was visible above the old brick Victorians of downtown, and the water looked gray, like a storm was coming in. I thought he would feel more comfortable surrounded by trees instead of walls. And did he? Yes, at first. We talked about Scrabble, and then he told me a bit about his childhood. Dr. Mita's gaze followed me as I sat down. Her reading glasses were still balanced on the end of her nose from when she'd been looking over the chart, and I felt like a specimen in a petri dish, another lab result she could trust for answers. My skin felt too tight, and a sickness began contracting my stomach. "Did he give you any more details about his father?" "No," I lied. "I know you've had a traumatic day yourself, but can you pinpoint any correlation between your discussion and what made him attempt to escape again?" "The body. A body with long brown hair. The sack of toys that wasn't worth turning his father over." I glanced at the bed and pretended to think, as I searched Lucas's face where dark bruises began to ring his eye sockets. My stomach pinched. Then I shook my head, meeting the hope and expectation in Dr. Mita's face. "Nothing obvious. His childhood memories were pleasant. I guess they had a dog at one point. So unless he's triggered by Scrabble, he must have been waiting for an opportunity. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have attempted it." Dr. Mita shook her head and motioned for me to come with her. "It was a good instinct. I see why you tried." She opened the door and held my arm to help me down the hall. Her touch, the warm, dry comfort of it, was hard to accept. "If you remember anything else about the session, something that may have upset him." I nodded, seeing only the bright red exit sign at the end of the hall. "I know what to do." The next morning I got a frantic text from Dad with a link to the video of Lucas, which had aired on all 4 local news stations, and who knew how many more across the state and country. I spent 15 minutes calming him down and telling him not to cut the Bannockburn expedition short, and I arrived late for my shift at Congdon to find Officer Miller waiting for me. She sized up the brace on my ankle, but didn't comment on it. holding me a thick manila envelope. That was fast. I unfastened it and peeked inside at the fat stack of paper. I looked the stuff over to see if it might help with the search, but didn't see anything useful. She crossed her arms. Arresting officer's information is on the top in case you need anything else. And don't feed me any crap like you don't know how to make a phone call. I checked on you too. I didn't know what to say. It was impossible to lie or play it off, but I couldn't talk about my time in Eli no more than I could have called the police station to request this case file myself. Silently, I reclasped the envelope and hugged it to my chest. When it became clear I wasn't going to offer any explanations, Officer Miller sighed and straightened her hat, nodding once before leaving. Happy reading. There was no time to go through it before my shift started. I stored the envelope in my locker and thought about nothing else during my morning sessions. Every hour dragged. I barely heard the jokes about how shocking my ankle looked or whether I was going to be the bride of Frankenstein for Halloween. Even one of my aphasia patients, Greta, had to throw flashcards at me to get my attention. When it was finally noon, followed by what was supposed to be an hour-long session with Lucas, I grabbed the envelope and hobbled to my car, driving to the hospital without a word to anyone. The nurse's station let me into Lucas's room and gave me an update. He'd been awake all night as the nurses, accompanied by security guards, administered drips, drew blood, and checked his vitals while he watched with a creepy intensity that made most of them hand the next round off to someone else. When I arrived, he'd finally fallen asleep. He seemed to be dreaming, mumbling and shifting restlessly in bed. I helped myself to the pudding, roll, and juice on his untouched lunch tray, ignoring the meat product that smelled identical to what we fed our patients, while pulling out the contents of the manila envelope on the other, unoccupied bed. As I chewed and read, the pieces slowly came together. Heather Price, a twice-divorced dental receptionist in LY, was reported missing after she didn't show up for work for 2 days. Her duplex was empty, but the police found clothes belonging to a man and boy in the side she rented out. My heart rate picked up. When they conducted their search, according to neighbors, she lived alone. While they were searching the home, the police encountered Josiah Blackthorne, who had just returned from a camping trip in the Boundary Waters. When asked about Miss Price, Josiah lied. He claimed he hadn't seen her since he last paid rent, a story that was disproved by two neighbors who'd witnessed them fighting. Believing he was somehow connected to the woman's disappearance, the police arrested Josiah for obstruction of justice. And Lucas? I flipped through pages, skimming for any mention of the boy's location, while his father was locked up, but there was nothing. A scared 9-year-old had no place in a criminal report. 2 days after the arrest, Heather's body was found. She died behind a house in the nearby town of Virginia, and the medical examiner put her date of death within the time frame Josiah's camping permit said he was in the Boundary Waters. Heroin was found in her body. The death was ruled as accidental overdose, and within a week, the Blackthorns disappeared. At the bottom of the pile of papers were a series of photographs, mostly shots of the corpse in the townhouse, but the last one looked like a print of an ID badge from her job. The woman smiled at the camera, with gaunt cheekbones and 2 white teeth, her face framed by perfectly styled, flowing brown hair. I stared at the picture and then jumped when a nurse and the security guard strode into the room. She glanced at the empty food containers on top of my stacks of papers and raised an eyebrow as she adjusted monitors and changed the IV drip. Has he woken up since you've been here? She asked. No, just a lot of that. I motioned to his twitching hands as he unconsciously pulled against the restraints. You could try talking to him, but I'd stay on that side of the room if I were you. Chocolate pudding isn't worth an assault. Depends on the pudding. Not that pudding. After tucking the sheet in and reporting his vitals, the two of them left me staring at Lucas's form, wishing I could take her advice. I needed to talk to someone, and I wished, for maybe the first time since I'd been committed, that I had a friend, someone I could trust. The street kids I ran with before Congdon had all heard what happened and avoided me like the plague after I got out. I started taking college classes in high school with no time for pep rallies or clubs, and by the time I officially started at the university, I was already a sophomore. Then it was all about getting accepted into the speech pathology master's program, and the few friends I made there were largely study partners. We bonded over anatomy and assistive technology, and we hugged each other goodbye after graduation. Dr. Mita called my lack of social support an attachment disorder. I never really cared about it until now. Lucas's head rolled toward me on his pillow. A dusting of beard colored his cheeks, which looked more sunken than yesterday. His wrists were raw from unconscious fights with the handcuffs. Grabbing a bottle from a side table, I picked up his hand and carefully rubbed some lotion over the red welts, feeling his pulse thrum in time to the blips on the monitor. As I finished one side, his fingers twitched and closed over mine. Lucas, I leaned closer. Can you hear me? His head flopped away, but his fingers tightened. I need you to wake it up. Do you know the name Heather Price? I said it again, studying his face for any reaction. Another head jerk and a few mumbled words. Nothing I could decipher. I moved to his other wrist, trying to figure out why I was playing nursemaid to an unconscious, difficult patient who only gave me injuries and riddles. His wrists were warm, though, and for a second I tried to remember the last time I'd reached out and voluntarily touched another person outside of work. No memory came to mind. I glanced at the door to make sure we were alone before carefully closing my hand around his and drawing it to my coat. I'm here. See? I'm right here. But you've got to wake your lazy ass up. Then I dropped my voice even further and admitted what I would never say to anyone conscious. The reason I was standing here with lotion-covered hands. I miss talking to you. My time was up. I had to get back to Congdon before the afternoon sessions began. Capping the bottle, I limped over to scoop up the police reports and stuff them away. Then, on an impulse, I left a picture of Heather Price on Lucas's bedside table, writing a note on top of it in thick black marker. Her, Maya. 8 hours later, I pulled up to the house and forced myself to get out of the car. In my first afternoon session, one of the female patients stomped on my ankle, laying me out flat, and all I could think as I gasped and clutched it was that I should have known better than to wear the brace. Some people look at Achilles and only saw a heel. I used a crutch from Nurse Valerie for the rest of the day, refused the ibuprofen she tried to give me, and spent the drive home counting the number of incident reports I'd had to file in the last 2 weeks. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Dr. Mita, but I let it go to voicemail and pulled up in front of the house. At least the day was over. All I had to do now was get myself from the car to my bed. No problem. I kept up the silent pep talk as I hobbled through the gate toward the house, where Jasper barked with manic excitement. As soon as I opened the door, he shot out to pee without even a sniff or a lick hello. Sorry, Jazz. I know it was a long day. Guilt wormed its way through the pain as I waited for him to take care of business until a voice too close to me said, "Long, but interesting." I whipped around, peering through the shadows to see Lucas standing by my front steps. Chapter 10. What the was all I got out before Jasper flew across the lawn. Lucas sprang backward and almost cleared the fence, but Jasper caught him by the foot and held on fast. Kicking, Lucas tried to shake the dog while straddling precariously on top of the chain link. Jasper, heel. He dropped Lucas's foot immediately and ran across the yard to stand guard between me and our trespasser, a low growl still trembling in his throat. Good boy, I scratched behind his ears. Good boy, Lucas echoed, squatting on the other side of the fence, holding his foot. Jasper barked. I stared at his huddled form, trying to wrap my head around the fact that he was somehow here and not unconscious in his hospital bed. How did he get out? How could he have walked all this way without being spotted by his Free Lucas Blackthorn fans? 3 of them were stationed outside Congdon right now, holding signs as I'd driven through the gate. Smoothing Jasper's fur, I checked both directions, finding no signs of life on the cracked pavement or behind the drawn shades lining either side of the street. Maybe it was the throb in my ankle, or the darkness, or the nervous rumbles vibrating under my hand, but long seconds passed where everything felt like I'd crossed into some alternate world in which cause and effect had simply drifted away from each other, disappearing as effortlessly as balloons in the night. I gave up. Turning in slow motion, I pulled Jasper inside. I took him to his kennel and paused to nuzzle the warmth of his bristly neck, to breathe in his earthiness until I felt grounded again. When I latched the door shut and turned around, Lucas was standing inside the front door watching me. He wore a long tan coat with one sleeve hanging loose because of the sling couching his fractured shoulder. His face looked even more drawn than when he'd been sleeping, shadowed with beard and eclipsed by those blue eyes. They followed me now as I slowly rose and faced him. I opened my mouth, torn between a dozen burning questions, before finally settling on a simple demand. Explain. Okay, he agreed, but said nothing else, instead peering inside the kitchen doorway. Then he moved along the hallway and looked in each room as if he'd never seen a house before. I supposed he hadn't, at least not in the last 10 years. He disappeared into my room, and I limped down the hall to find him staring at a bed. He startled when he heard me and ran a hand along the wall, stopping at a bookshelf full of rock guides and speech pathology textbooks. This is where you sleep. Yes. He frowned at the dark blue walls and took a few halting steps into the room before edging back around me, so close I could smell alcohol swabs and the bleached cotton of hospital scrubs. And the other door? Where my father sleeps when he's not on the boat. As he turned on Dad's bedroom light and surveyed the room, I flexed my foot, testing it, putting weight on it. If it came down to my sprained ankle versus his broken shoulder, my ankle would win. Lucas barely seemed aware of my presence, though instead, inspecting the minutia of the bedroom, an end table cluttered with work gloves, drill bits, and creased maps, rows of weatherproof jackets in various stages of succumbing to the weather, hanging in the closet, and a dark wood jewelry box set back in the corner away from everything else. What are you doing? Skirting past me again, he opened the linen closet and then went into the bathroom. When I followed, he was standing next to the toilet, staring at the piece of driftwood I'd found on the shore last summer. I'd cleaned, sealed, and mounted the gnarled branch on one of the leftover slate tiles, and when Dad first saw it, his mouth had dropped open. It's beautiful, Maya, he said. I can't believe you took garbage and made it into this. Running a hand over the wood, Lucas turned, shaking his head at the space I'd worked so hard to transform. Lucas, I squared off, blocking the door. I don't know this house. His wrists were still raw from the handcuffs he'd somehow escaped. I took a step further and braced my weight. Of course you don't. You've never been here before. I remember. He swirled around, searching all the walls. I remember a mountain of salt. A mountain of salt? I shook my head, trying to make sense of what he was saying. There were giant sand and taconite piles in the commercial zones near the harbor. But salt? Where would he have been something that looked like a mountain of salt? I only have a little salt shaker here. Do you want to see it? He didn't reply, sinking instead into a crouch on the floor and holding his head. The doctor had warned about a possible concussion. Then I noticed one of his slippers, the kind they gave to patients to use the bathroom or go to the cafeteria, was turning red. Come on, you're bleeding. I helped him back to his feet and checked his pupils, which looked normal, then grabbed the first aid kit out of the cabinet. Jasper whined when we passed through the living room. So, this was your grand plan? I couldn't help the dazed laugh that bubbled out of my mouth when we got to the kitchen. You wanted to escape Congdon to visit my house? I should have just brought some cookies and gone home instead of killing myself trying to stop you. He frowned at his foot, looking calmer now. Maybe you could have locked up your dog, too. I think whoever trespasses in a yard with a sign that says, attack dog on sight, enter at your own risk, deserves whatever they get. Why do you have an attack dog? I dropped into a chair, exhaling gratefully at the relief of pressure on my ankle. My dad got him as sort of a welcome home present after I'd been gone once. He's a sailor, so he lives on the lake for a good part of the year, and he worries. He thinks I need protection. Now it was Lucas's turn to laugh, and I couldn't help grinning. I know, right? Dad trained him as a guard dog, but he's a big softy underneath, and it's nice to have the company. The nights can get pretty long in the winter. Yes, they can. His smile faded. After a moment, he seemed to forget about Jasper and dropped into a chair, studying the kitchen as if looking for something he had misplaced. I watched him carefully, trying to gauge his mental state and how to approach whatever came next. "What about your mom?" he asked after an awkward pause. I shrugged, dousing some cotton balls in iodine. "She didn't stick around." "Take off your slipper and put your foot on the table." He did, letting me examine it. There were two shallow scrapes from Jasper's and scissors, with some abrasions on either side. I swabbed the worst of it, ignoring his hiss of pain. The longer I wiped the blood off and applied bandages, the more surreal the situation became. Lucas Blackthorne was sitting at my kitchen table like he'd just dropped by to hang out. I should have called Congdon the minute I saw him. Or I should have let Jasper hold him while I phoned the police. As if I knew what I was thinking. My cell phone bleeped to tell me I had another message from Dr. Mita, and it finally occurred to me why she'd been calling. "There's probably a manhunt out for you now." "Why?" "You tend to attack people, haven't you noticed?" "So does your dog. Why isn't he being chased down and locked up?" Raising an eyebrow, I swung a hand toward the living room, where Jasper clearly could be heard scratching at the kennel door. Lucas smiled with chagrin. "Are you going to turn me in?" "Any minute now." I stuffed the bloody slipper back on his foot, trying not to think about why I was postponing the uninvitable. He'd assaulted the couple who'd found him robbing the outfitter store. He'd choked, fought, and shoved me, and his file at Congdon clearly labeled him dangerous. But he was also injured, and there was something different about him in the dull light of my kitchen. The way he was still inspecting the house, even now, drinking in the details of the spice rack and coffee pot, with an intuitiveness that was almost endearing. A boy who'd never learned manners, who'd never been told not to stare. "How's your shoulder?" He ran a hand over the coat. "It aches a little, not bad." So the pain meds were still working. He hadn't been loose long. "Did you strangle anyone to get out this time?" "Didn't need to." His face split into an unexpected grin, and he began chatting freely. "I pretended to be sleeping until they took off my handcuffs to change my clothes. When they left to get something, I slipped out the window, took a jacket from an unlocked truck, and headed toward the lake. From there, it was easy to find your house." I grabbed an ice pack from the freezer, remembering how I'd showed him my street on the map of Duluth. It was a mistake real psychiatrists wouldn't make, giving personal information to their patients. As I came back to sit at the table, Lucas described the people he'd seen roaming the streets: the homeless, the packs of college kids, the drunken tourists, and the older couples bundled in their pea coats for dinner on the town. I waited for him to finish, then casually asked if anyone had noticed him. As far as I knew, he was totally unaware of his fame or the controversy his reappearance had created. He said he'd stuck to the shadows. No one had spoken to him. I nodded, glancing into the darkness outside the window. "Why?" The question slipped out before I could find a more professional frame for it. "Why are you here?" His gaze lingered on me. Slowly, he drew my hand across the table, taking the pack from me and setting it down. "A couple reasons. The first is that I miss talking to you, too." "Too?" I pulled back in surprise as it registered. "You were awake?" "Sort of. I was surfacing when you were there, and by the time I wake up, you'd left. I would have come back tomorrow." He shrugged. That wasn't soon enough. The way he said it made heat flood my cheeks, and embarrassed, I ducked my head and started to remove my boot, but he lifted my foot onto his lap. "What are you doing?" "You fix my foot, I'll fix yours." He pulled off the boot and sock to reveal the swollen, wrapped ankle. "I saw you limping when you got out of the car." "What happened?" "Gymnastics injury." I nodded to the ice pack, which he applied to the swelling. His hands closed around my calf and beneath my foot. I could feel his whole body tightening. He seemed to be searching for something in me, a sign, and I didn't know what to do besides return his turbulent stare and wait. Finally, he took a deep breath and decided. We never talked about it, my dad and I. Sometimes I even thought I dreamed the whole thing. He paused and his gaze turned inward, seeing things I couldn't. He only told me one thing about the world outside, that they would take me away from him. They would separate us and we would lose each other, maybe forever. He promised he would never let that happen, but now it's happened anyway because of me. He leaned in until I could see my own reflection in his eyes, tiny and paralyzed. That's the second reason I'm here, to ask for your help. It's why I'm going to tell you. He paused, faltering. Tell me what? Why we had to hide. I made some noodles, the nice udon ones instead of ramen, and foraged the kitchen for mushrooms, onions, and shreds of leftover chicken to stir into a simmering soup that could warm the coldest of Duluth's stomachs. Lucas stared at the pictures on the refrigerator while I cooked. The blackthorns, lichens, and hovans, all lined up like members of the same social experiment performed every 40 years across the globe. The boy Lucas was the only one smiling, beaming out at us, unaware of his fate, while adult Lucas swallowed and quickly moved on to examine the appliance itself, tracing the lines of the doors, the hardware practically getting his head caught between the fridge and the wall in order to see how the wiring worked. When the soup was done, I set one of the bowls in front of his chair and put mine on the opposite side of the table. You have to slurp these. It's polite. I showed him how to grab the noodles with the chopsticks and suck them out of the broth. He mirrored my every move as carefully as he'd done during those first tense therapy sessions. Mastering the chopsticks without any issue but slurping too quickly, he whiplashed one of the noodles and ended up with broth all over his face. Laughing, I handed him a napkin. We didn't eat food like this, my dad and I, Lucas commented after a while, swirling his noodles with the chopsticks and smiling at the merry-go-round it created in his bowl. We had a lot of rice and fish, dried fruit, dried vegetables. Once we had a huge container of oatmeal, and we added blueberries and spices. It was way better than the stuff Carol at Condon calls oatmeal. Are there different kinds? Institution meals aren't the best of Minnesota cuisine. And this is? He took another bite, slurping respectably loud enough. I shot him a dirty noodle-chewing look. It isn't terrible, he offered. Thank you for sharing your delicious food, Maya, I prompted, dabbing my mouth with the napkin. Thank you for sharing your food, Maya, he replied pointedly, grinning. We finished the udon with only the occasional whine from Jasper, interrupting the silence, looking at each other, then away. He'd taken off the stolen jacket, and it was hard not to notice the line of muscle in his arms as he lifted the bowl and drank his broth. Arms that had easily overpowered me the first time we'd met, that had practically scaled 10 feet of fence before I'd caught up with him. He said he needed my help, but if I understood anything about Lucas, it was that he was unpredictable. Even with one limb in a sling, I didn't know what those arms were going to do next. I collected the bowls and rinsed them out, then limped to the living room and let Jasper out of his kennel, murmuring to him to behave. Lucas stepped into the edge of the room and waited. After a moment's hesitation, Jasper trotted over, sniffed his legs and feet, snorted disdainfully, and went to his dog bed to lounge. Lucas lifted an eye. So I'm okay now? As long as I like you, he likes you. I dropped into the faded blue armchair next to the dog bed and absently scratched his ears. I told you he's a big softy. Lucas walked to the window, moving more stiffly than before we ate, which meant the meds were probably wearing off. With only the kitchen light to illuminate him, he looked tall and somehow lonely. I lived in a house like this when my mother was alive. Now, the memory of it is mixed up with my memory of her. I remember warmth, soft lights, her legs folded into a rocking chair. There was a box with a bright orange fish that she fed, and afterward her hands smelled like the lake in the morning.